So I have a question for you. If you had the options of having some very decent tacos tonight or having the best tacos you've ever eaten 2 months from now, which would you choose? I use this analogy because I had some Mexican food yesterday and it was so good that I almost wept. I woke up this morning still thinking about it, but it relates to the topic I want to talk about, because if you are capable of willing to make that choice of having the great tacos in 2 months, then you are capable of something called delayed gratification. And this is kind of interesting. Basically seems to be something that young children aren't capable of. Not satisfying their needs right now, but waiting for something better in the future. It's just not part of their brain yet. But as you grow up, you get better at that. You develop the ability to do it. It's a trait that is associated with adulthood and maturity and mental soundness. And I think delayed gratification is something that fighting game players specialize in. I mean, this is conjecture, but I think it might be the reason when you look at the average age of a decent fighting game player, they tend to be between their mid-20s to mid-30s, whereas if you look at some of these other popular video games, I don't know what the kids are playing, Fort guys, I think the average age is a lot lower. Now, Tekken 7 recently went past 6 million copies sold. It's officially one of the most commercially successful fighting games in the modern sort of post-Street Fighter 4 era. And the characters celebrated by having a Zoom meeting in their pajamas, which I thought was cute, by the way. But if you are developing a game in this genre right now, especially if you're one of the developers working on Tekken specifically, then you're definitely asking yourself this question of why does this game do so well? And the reason I'm making this video today is I think that if they arrive at the wrong answer to that question, if they arrive at the wrong conclusions, then we might be in dire straits. Tekken 7 is supposed to be the casual Tekken, or casual actually isn't the right word. It's supposed to be the most beginner friendly, the least intimidating to start for someone who has little to no experience with fighting games. It was a stated main goal when this game was being developed, and I've listed a couple of the major things that went into Tekken 7 to make it that, as opposed to its predecessor Tag 2. I think the biggest one here might be the focus that seems to exist on 50-50 mix-ups, and I think the blanket nerf to movement has helped emphasize mix-ups, because when you're applying a true mix-up, experience becomes less of a factor. It doesn't matter that much how good your opponent is when they are genuinely forced to guess. And if the combo you can do when you mix successfully is so powerful that you almost end the round right away, then you can conceivably beat anybody, right? And this seems to be something that the developers are still worrying about. We've seen balance changes and communications that indicate that throughout the game's lifespan. And I think a good example is when Hell Sweeps were suddenly given tracking properties, and the stated justification was that if you are applying your mix-up and somebody knows how to neutralize that with movement, then that's not fun for you. And it was very uncomfortable for many of us. It was kind of like a bucket of ice water over the head, because it indicated this schism that seems to exist between the people who create the game and the people who play it. So yes, Tekken 7 has done very well, and it's a beginner-friendly game for a Tekken game, but is correlation really causation here? Is the reason the game sold many copies the fact that it seems to cater more to a less experienced audience? Well, I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think what helps to sell copies of a game, it's the stuff I call fluff. It's new exciting characters, it's single player modes, cool cinematics, beautiful visuals, hype trailers and guest characters, stuff like that. But that won't help you retain a player base after that initial purchase, and it's definitely not going to produce a competitive player base that will produce experts, because why would you care about being very, very good at a competitive game when the developers have tried so hard to level the playing field that there's little to distinguish between somebody with a lot of experience and somebody with none. And if you look at it on a surface level, a fighting game match is pretty much the same thing every time. It's two characters on a stage fighting. The reason we're willing to play these games for years and years at a time is the fact that there is serious competitive depth and meaningful difficulty in there. To us who don't look at the surface level, it's different every time. It changes, and there are things for us to strive for, things that we can get better at. There's delayed gratification, and that's the reason we care about being good at these games. I'm not even sure I believe that there can be such a thing as a competitively interesting fighting game that isn't intimidating to new players, because I believe that fighting games are inherently abrasive to fragile people. And if you think about some of the other genres of competitive video game, if you're playing a battle royale, you have dozens and dozens of players in the same chaotic environment. You might just end up with somebody's back facing you and your gun pointing at their neck. If you're playing a MOBA, you're in teams of 5 against 5 players. The entire burden on winning is not on your shoulders. You can play with friends and other people who can teach you about how to play. There's a chat, there are all these things, but in a fighting game, it's like throwing you into a silent room with one other person, and then it's just ready, fight. And if you don't have what it takes, you're going to lose, and you're probably going to lose the next game and the game after that. And if that is the kind of thing that is very scary to you, then I don't think you're the kind of person who becomes a competitive fighting game player. I think the people who stick with this genre are players who are able to turn that experience into a source of motivation, with people who can get excited about the prospect of actually learning, people who are capable of delayed gratification, who are motivated by the idea that I suck right now, but I might suck slightly less at some point in the future. On one of the Wave Dash podcasts, we talked about the Korean backdash cancel. Arya had this idea of what if you implement an easier to perform version of the backdash that isn't quite as evasive as the Korean cancel. And it's an interesting idea. It's another idea to lessen that skill gap between people who know movement in this game and people who don't. But I think it's obvious what your answer will be depending on where you are as a player, because if you are very experienced and you do a lot of Korean canceling right now, you probably don't want this because it provides a shortcut for newer players to catch up to your level that you didn't have access to. And so in a relative sense, it kind of cheapens your progress as a player. But if you're somebody who's struggling to learn movement right now, you probably wouldn't mind it being a little bit more forgiving. But I honestly believe that when people say that they want this game to be easier, they don't actually want the game to be easier. They're just scared that it won't matter how hard they try. They still won't be able to get to a point where they can play this game at a high level. But if you had a player with those doubts and you could go to them from the future in a time machine and say, I've met you 6 months in the future and your movement is much cleaner and you're winning a lot more because of it, do you think that that player would still be in favor of movement being nerfed in this game, of execution being nerfed in this game? I don't think so. I think you have the confidence then to delay your gratification and to wait for that magical moment where you can look back and see that you've made meaningful progress with something. I think that's what we're out there hunting. If that's what you're out there hunting, I think you're the kind of person who would like to have tacos with me 2 months from now. And now, after I don't know how many minutes of talking, I'm finally going to get to the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place. It's something that happened about 2 months ago, and it kind of flew under the radar, which surprised me because it blew my mind completely. But it's an interview with Harada, the creator of Tekken. I think it happened in conjunction with that big fighting game panel where they had developers from all kinds of different fighting games, and I've taken this from Event Hubs here referencing that interview, but they asked Harada about the future of fighting games, and he said that he believes that the future of fighting games is AI, and the example that he brings up is an AI that will learn your tendencies as a player, and then when you mess up execution, when you do something wrong, the game will assume what you actually wanted to do and then do it for you anyway. So in essence, rollback execution. And the reason this really blew my mind is I cannot come up with a more efficient and clean way of completely ruining everything that is special about Tekken with the implementation of one single feature. It might be the most catastrophically out of touch thing I have ever heard a video game developer say. And the example I want to bring up here is Mishima players. You probably know a couple, maybe you are one, but it's an entire subculture of Tekken players who obsess about and worship the execution of one single move, the Electric Wind Godfist. Some of them work for literally decades at becoming very good at doing only this move. Imagine if the next version of Tekken rolls out and you can mess up the execution of your electric, but the game will just do it for you anyway. All of their progress will become meaningless in an instant. It will be a completely level playing field where you can do anything that is difficult in this game as soon as you start out. It also doesn't really make sense, because if you want all of the execution in the game to be trivial, you could just make simpler inputs. You could tie a move like the electric to an input like down forward 2, kind of like what Jinpachi had in Tekken Tag 2. Why would you want all of these difficult execution elements to be in the game and then completely trivialize them with a feature like this? Now, I want to be fair here and say, for example, I've been working in a company in the tourism industry here in Asia for many years, and when me and my colleagues get together and we talk about the future of this industry, we will say things like, well, in the future we'll have AI piloted airplanes and automated check-in counters, and people will be able to take trips in virtual reality. Maybe Harada just got a question that he wasn't prepared for and he tried to pull something clever out his ass. But if this is genuinely something that he believes is the future of fighting games, and I think if we look at this sort of casualization of Tekken up until this point, it does seem likely, then I think we might be in trouble. Maximilian Dude made a video talking about similar topics over a year ago now, and I was watching it back recently. It's very good. I encourage you to see it if you haven't. But when I was watching it back, I noticed his shirt for the first time, and if you've been playing fighting games for a while, you probably know what this shirt is referencing. It's the Daigo full parry, probably the most iconic moment in competitive fighting games, maybe in competitive video games. And it's crazy to me that there's a t-shirt referencing not a specific old fighting game, but a specific moment in a round of that game being played. It's that legendary. But the reason people are so impressed with what Daigo Umehara did is the fact that it's very, very difficult. And I know plenty of people who play Street Fighter and who play specifically Third Strike to this day because they saw this one moment. And people do still play Third Strike. I am convinced that you could release DLC for that game this month and plenty of people would buy it. It's loved to that extent, and I think that's a really cool culture to shoot for when you're making these games, rather than focusing more on selling more copies in the short term. Because when you make fighting games less difficult, you alienate the experts, but you also remove these stars to shoot for the newer players. You remove the motivation that is going to make them want to become the great players of the future. I just want to say here at the end that I'm not trying to be overly critical of the developers of Tekken again, because I honestly feel like we're in a pretty cool spot right now. Based on what they're saying, at least, we might be heading for the best state the game has ever been in with Season 4. It's a period of really good communication. This is more me worrying about that next step and the next generation, because I don't think the lesson we should learn from Tekken 7 is that the way to make a fighting game successful is to dumb it down and make it more accessible. I think Tekken 7 is successful because it has a good mix of some accessibility with a strong competitive scene and serious competitive depth. Movement is less emphasized, but it's still very important. There are plenty of difficult things to learn, and if you remove them, I think you remove what makes the game special. So what could you do to encourage more people to learn without removing these important elements? Well, I think a very good idea is well implemented tutorials, and I think the shining example that we have so far is punishment training. If you haven't tried it, it's a feature in the game right now. The game will simulate a punishment scenario, and then if you do the right move, it will give you a sound effect and tell you that you did well. And I don't see any reason why you couldn't expand that to include difficult to execute moves like electrics, or maybe even sidestepping strings. And then there's a feature that bridges the gap between the cool things that you see high level players do in the tournaments that you watch and what you are capable of doing on the screen yourself when you're playing. So I think that's a more interesting and healthy way to go about it. It can be easier to learn the game, but I don't want there to be fewer things to learn. Just my thoughts on execution and the future of this franchise and other fighting games. Hope it was at least a little bit interesting. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys again very soon.